Bea Green and the Bee Queen by Emma Owen. Chapter 1. Bea sat on the broken metal watering can next to her dad's vegetable patch and dried her eyes. At least down here she couldn't hear them arguing. Why did her parents have to be so different? Sophie's mum and dad both went line dancing every Wednesday, and they sang in a choir together. Bea's mum and dad were like, well, Bea looked around her. Tomatoes and cucumbers. Totally, completely, and absolutely opposite in every way. She peered through her dirty hands at her dad's old wooden shed by the compost heap. He would be quite happy living there all the time, she thought with a smile, while her mum would only be at home in a palace. She loved everything to do with royalty. What did Dad call it? Her obsession. She'd even named Bea after the princesses, Beatrice and Eugenie. Bea shivered. She hated her names. Dad had only agreed to them because he wanted to call her Bea. Bea Green by name and Bea Green by nature, he'd say to her. It was a lot to live up to for a 10-year-old, especially as she had to try to please both of them all of the time. She looked up at the house. What a start to half-term. If only she had someone to talk to, someone who understood what it was like. Sophie was a good friend, but she'd gone to the seaside for half-term, and her mum had banned her mobile phone while she was away. Bea sighed. A bee flew up to her face and buzzed at her. "Buzz off," she said, flapping her hands. "Buzz off yourself," squeaked a little voice. Bea looked around. "Who said that?" she said, feeling silly talking to the air. Maybe Miss Bacon, her next-door neighbour, was playing a trick on her. She waved her arms like a windmill, hoping the bee would fly away. It didn't. It flew in her ear instead. Zzzz. It sounded like one of those pneumatic drills they use to dig up the roads. "Ah!" she screamed. Lily Taylor had been stung by a bee on the school trip to the sewage farm last term. She'd swollen up like a watermelon and went into a anaphylactic shock or something. Mrs. Finch had called an ambulance, and the paramedics took Lily to hospital. But then she's allergic to loads of stuff. Bees, peanuts, bread, kiwi fruit. She just has to look at them and she starts to swell. "Get out!" Bea shouted, shaking her head. "Go away!" The bee flew in front of her, and Bea batted it with her hand. She felt it quiver under her fingers, and it spiraled to the ground like a sycamore seed in the autumn. Bea gulped. Her dad was always going on about protecting the environment. Did that include bees? Then she heard the squeaky voice again. "Ow! That hurt! Watch what you're doing, will you?" She jumped and gave the bee a hard stare. "What are you looking at?" said the little voice. "Never seen a bee before?" It was the bee that was talking. Bea could see its mouth moving. It stared back at her with two big bulging eyes, and when Bea bent really close, she could see three more tiny eyes in a triangle in the middle of its head. Weird. The bee bent its two front legs, as if it had its hands on its hips. Thought Bea, this bee's got attitude. It flew over to the strawberry patch and sat on the green netting. Just a minute, Bea thought. This is real life. Bees definitely do not talk in real life. I must be dreaming. She pinched herself. Hard. "Ouch," she said. "What a silly thing to do," the bee said, wiggling its long body. "Still, it serves you right, ha!" Bea's head was spinning, like when she was on a teacup ride at the fair. I've been out in the sun too long, she thought, looking up at the clear blue sky. "Look, I don't know how you're talking, but I'm sorry I hit you, okay?" she said, leaning over the tiny insect. "Pick on someone your own size next time," the bee huffed. "You big bully." Its words stung. Bea felt her eyes filling up again. The bee jumped back quickly as her tears splashed its furry body. "Hey, watch out, you'll drown me." "Sorry," Bea spluttered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The bee flew onto her shoulder. Bea flinched. "Didn't mean to hurt me," it said. "Huh, I wouldn't like to see you when you mean business." Bea sniffed and wiped her hand across her nose. "What's up?" asked the bee. "Oh, you wouldn't understand. You're just a bee." "Is that what you think?" said the bee. "Actually, I'm not just a bee. I am Her Royal Highness, Princess Elizabeth the 52nd. "Ooh, a princess," Bea teased with a faint smile. "You," said the bee, puffing up her stripy body and spreading her wings. "I'm not just talking to any old bee here. I am next in line to the throne, you know." Just then Bea noticed Miss Bacon. She was peering over the garden fence, staring at Bea with her piggy little eyes. "What are you doing down there all on your own?" she asked, waving a garden fork. "I'm not," said Bea. "Don't talk back, I know you're up to something. Who were you talking to?" "No one." "Don't be cheeky or I'll tell your parents," she said in a squeaky high-pitched voice. Suddenly the bee flew over to Miss Bacon and settled on her nose. "Ah!" Miss Bee screamed and slapped the end of her nose with the fork. But the bee was too quick and flew onto her ear. Miss Bacon boxed her ear, but by now the bee was on her eyebrow. Bea laughed out loud. "Humph!" snorted Miss Bacon, and ran back into the house, her large bottom wobbling from side to side in her pink tracksuit. "That was hilarious," Bea said, as the bee flew back to her. "Glad to be of service," said the bee. She waved her front right leg. "Pleased to meet you, Bee." "Bee?" it frowned. "You're called Bee?" "Yes," Bea laughed. "It's not my real name, it's just the short form. My real name is much worse, but it's only my mum who ever uses it, thank goodness. She chose it. A name fit for a princess, she says." Bea rolled her eyes. "You're a princess too?" "No way," Bea said quickly, "although my mum would like me to be. She's really into the royal family. She's always looking at them on the web." "Web? Are they spiders?" "No, silly, the World Wide Web, not a spider's web," Bea giggled. "It is funny, you know, talking to an insect." "Not as strange as talking to a human, believe me." "So you're a real princess, are you?" "Yes, I told you, didn't I? Her Royal Highness, Princess Elizabeth the 5th. Yes, Bea interrupted. "That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? What do your friends call you?" "Well," the bee paused, "I don't really have any friends, just royal attendants." "Oh, well, can I call you, Bessie?" "Oh, yes, I like that. Bessie." "So, Bessie, you're going to be queen one day. That sounds wicked." "At last, someone who understands," Bessie sighed, wiping her brow dramatically. "You're right, it is wicked. Terrible, in fact." Bessie zoomed around as she spoke. Bea found it hard to follow her. Eventually, she settled on Bea's knee. "What do you mean, terrible?" Bea was confused. Surely it would be fun to be queen. "My mother, the queen bee, will be swarming soon with half the hive, leaving me in charge of the rest of the bees. I only have a few days of freedom left. I'll never be able to fly where I like again." She suddenly took off into the air and zoomed round and round as if she was on a roller coaster. "Why not?" frowned Bea, trying to keep up. "You'll be the queen, won't you? So you make the rules." "That's what I thought," said Bessie. "But Her Majesty keeps going on about tradition, heritage, and responsibility." She sighed. It feels like I have the weight of the world on my wings. I know what you mean, Bea said. My dad's always going on about carbon footprints and protecting the planet for future generations. He's probably the greenest person in the world. I don't think I'll ever be green enough for him. Green? Said Bessie. But you're not green at all. You're pink. Suddenly Miss Bacon appeared over the fence again, with a can in her hand. Where is it? She shouted. Where's that nasty little bee? Bea glanced over at Bessie, and Miss Bacon held up the can. She pressed her fat thumb down on the nozzle, and a jet of poisoned liquid sprayed out in every direction.